Hi. So we talk a lot on Lot or Not about why journalism has failed. And of course, that has consequences for the political environment, which has resulted in Western democracies losing credibility, basically. And we want to think about what's really going on. And a few days ago, or I think recently, there were protests in the Iowa state capitol that were reminiscent of what happened in the national capital a while ago. The difference is that these photos and the coverage for this, I guess, insurrection or protest, which was for the most part a peaceful protest, you are not being widely distributed. You can't really see it on the front page of any non-local media outlet. Even if you go to the Des Moines National Register, you have to scroll about halfway down before you see it. So you can find it, but again, the lack of coverage is interesting, especially in light of what happened at the national capital. And you can see how this would fuel debate and division within the United States, because the protest in Iowa was I guess you could call it a Democratic or left-wing protest. And it was, again, for the most part, a peaceful protest. One person was arrested, which tells you that it was basically a peaceful protest. And in that instance of the arrest, it appears that the allegation being made is that somebody touched a police officer's arm, which the police officer is alleging, along with the DA, constitutes assault. And what may have happened is that the police officer overreacted, and then, upon being touched, forcibly arrested the protester, and then had the DA cover his back by charging the protester with assault. And you can see how protesting, just something as simple as protesting, requires somebody back you. Because, once you've been charged with a DA, you have to have a lawyer. And in that case, you're in a position where somebody has to pay for that. And I know you can get a public defender, but, for the most part, you may not necessarily want one, because you can't choose, right? You have no idea which public defender will be assigned to you. And of course, you're better off getting somebody that has perhaps a lower caseload. And overall, you can see, again, one of the sources of division in the United States is just a lack of equal coverage. And quite frankly, just a lack of context. And we want to figure out where all this comes from. And most of it comes from a desire to control the narrative in order to advertise your culture and your institutions as superior to the alternative or to others, which of course makes it easier for people to invest in your country because they believe your country is more stable than someone else's. And money is finite. It's either in one bank account in one country or in another bank account in another country. It's not as if you can, I'm sure you can, if you have a lot of money, you can put it in different bank accounts, but for the most part, if you find someplace safe that protects property, there probably isn't going to be a lot of need for even a millionaire or a multimillionaire to forum shop. And you can see how this division, also involves religion. This idea that culture and religion overlap. And, from my perspective, just looking at what happens when prominent people start dating Muslims or Middle Eastern men within Western media, it's a bit troubling, that overlap between religion and this idea of cultural superiority. And the example, one example would be just Princess Diana begins dating a billionaire's son, I should say, and Princess Diana dies in what is apparently a security lapse. Janet Jackson begins dating a Qatari prince. They are divorced, or they're going through a divorce at this point. I believe Michael Jackson also converted to Islam. And again, he was prosecuted by the district attorney. Again, all these things happened after the conversion or the dating. Britney Spears is now dating someone of Iranian descent. And so there's a sense that a lot of the division in Western democracies is also happening because people are trying desperately to maintain an image that may not necessarily be conducive to cooperation in a winner-take-all environment where you're trying to show my system is better, come over, live here, invest here. Now, Britney Spears is, of course, an interesting case because she's in a conservatorship, which means that a court somewhere found her unable to manage her own life, basically her own assets, and so on. I'm not giving legal advice, by the way. I haven't seen the documentary. I'm just trying to explain that the legal system in this country, whether it's a police officer in Des Moines, or a police officer in Iowa, or a police officer in the national capital, the idea is that Western democracies are now apparently in danger because they're becoming increasingly exposed as just like everywhere else. At the same time that non-Western democracies, or just not democracies at all, as we can call them Eastern hybrids, at the same time that they're doing quite well on the surface. And in some cases, it's not just a superficial gain. There's no doubt that China has succeeded wildly over the last 20 years, more so than any other country, and it has exceeded expectations even beyond the high ones that were set for it and its economy, particularly with its middle class. And you can see when I was growing up, actually, it didn't matter whether or not the country was even an ally. If it was Singapore, most people in this country still think that Singapore, which has the most successful political leadership of any other country for the last 50 years, or more than that, but, which has been more successful, which has about a 10% population that are millionaires, which has $1 trillion sovereign wealth fund. People associate the country still with a caning incident that occurred. Japan, when I was growing up, when Abe was elected, the only news stories that I saw online, and even in print, had to do with his hair. In other words, the hair represented a grand vision for the future because it was so unlike stringent Japanese cultural standards. Nothing about the system, nothing about post-World War II reconstruction, nothing about demographics. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that the division in this country has occurred because journalism has failed. And the censorship, this idea that Western democracies are clamping down on dissent in order to maintain the narrative, is happening because Eastern hybrid systems, either the allegation is that they either don't allow this kind of media, these media stunts. You can't, for example, imagine anybody entering the Chinese national capital and doing a sit-in or a protest. And at least not, without having a response that is censored by the government. And again, that's something that's natural. Every government does this, whether Eastern, Western, or anywhere else. There's a wrestling tournament going on now in Kazakhstan. I tried to watch the video on my laptop here in the US. And this is based on a Swiss-based organization that runs a world wrestling media channel. And I was not able to watch. They directed me, because of content restrictions and licensing restrictions, to a US-based site that I have to pay for. So just a while ago, the content was available. I might have had to use a VPN, but I could still watch it. And now, as democracies or just governments are clamping down, you've got this idea that everything is being clamped down because we want to have a society where each country is able to determine its own narrative without what might be called psychological operations or political stunts. When you throw in something like social media into the mix, it becomes even more problematic. Because now you've got this idea that technology is global, inherently global, and yet content restrictions are obviously local. And this is not something that's, if it sounds too conspiratorial, you have to remember that the CIA has a venture capital arm called In-Q-Tel. And the CIA was one of Facebook's backers back in the day. And if you think about what intelligence agencies do, what they do is their job is to gather information, gather data. And Facebook started out gathering facial recognition data and perfecting that technology. And of course has now moved into just a data gathering behemoth. So it does make sense, this overlap between, the intelligence gathering community and social media. But once you start, particularly once you start looking at the revenues and realizing that, individuals cannot pay for that kind of coverage. And so it has to be governments or large organizations or corporations or all the above. In fact, I was looking last night on something called unsplash.com, which looks a great idea. They offer, I'm not affiliated with them, they offer photos that anybody can use without a copyright. And usually if you're an independent publisher like I am, you're always afraid of publishing anything that you haven't done yourself, simply because there might be an issue with either copyright or something else, even under a fair use doctrine. And overall, obviously the standards are different for a business as opposed to something that's completely a non-profit. And you can see that even this business, Upsplash, has a beta program where it's inviting advertisers to come in. Well, in order to be a part of that campaign, to be invited to advertise, the minimum amount is $50,000. That's the minimum for this independent, essentially what appears to be an upstart company that's trying to change the game when it comes to advertising. So right away, when the numbers get that high, you can see that we're now dealing with major players, government organizations, millionaires, billionaires, private security organizations, and basically everybody but the individual, religious organizations, and so on. So you put all these things together, and you start to realize that a lot of what's happening in Western democracies is being fueled by big players attempting to pressure governments into doing their bidding, whether that's on gun legislation or anything else, such as the laws that are currently being debated in Iowa that would impose harsher penalties on some protesters while confirming qualified immunity for police officers. You can see how there's always, in this country, a reaction to an attempt to mold or shape the narrative, particularly where legislation is involved. And legislation, of course, is an attempt to mold society's culture from high up. That's why in this country, unlike, say, in many other countries, the national leadership is almost always a lawyer. Obama was a lawyer, his wife was a lawyer, Joseph Biden is a lawyer, Kamala Harris is a lawyer, Donald Trump's vice president is a lawyer. So remember, even when you elect the outsider, a businessman like Donald Trump, you're still dealing with lawyers. That is not the case in most countries. Because again, most countries don't have this system in place of attempting to shape the narrative in the same way that we do, in order to attract capital, which of course is going to be protected by the legal system and by the lawyers and by the judges. And so you put all that together, and suddenly something as simple as a congressional hearing goes off the rails. And if you look at a lot of the congressional hearings, not really in the Senate, but in the House of Representatives here in the United States, we had a while ago a hearing on hate crimes. We've had quite a few on social media, and they're all a waste of time at this point, because particularly where Facebook is involved, they will simply give you a long answer that makes no sense, that doesn't actually address the issue. And they're able to do that because if a congressperson cuts in or interrupts, Facebook can take that moment, either of anger or frustration, and put it out of context and damage that politician's ability to get reelected. And Facebook knows this, and as a result, creates a situation where it makes itself almost immune from oversight, simply because even when you get the CEO sitting before you, if the CEO or the counsel of that company is unable to give you a straight answer and wastes your time in an environment where each congressperson's time is limited, all you got to do is keep talking nonsense and generalities, and eventually you move on to the next guy and the next guy, and nothing's actually happened. They're not able to get information they need to regulate you. That, of course, explains why regulation, despite being run by lawyers, is failing in this country. And why, when the legislation fails, the executive branch tends to gain more power, because if legislation fails in a country in an increasingly divided environment, the next step is the executive branch, police officers in the military, also get frustrated and decide to take matters into their own hands. This has happened in every country, regardless of whatever system is in place. When the elites fail, the executive branch comes in. The other pattern, of course, is that minorities are often blamed, and sometimes civil war results. So, again, nothing new, and particularly nothing new in terms of division. If you think that we're divided now, go back and look at the debates with William Buckley Jr. and Gore Vidal. During that debate, in a famous moment, Gore Vidal claims that his conservative counterpart, intellectual counterpart, is quote-unquote a crypto-Nazi. What does that mean? A lot of people don't know what that means, the word crypto, especially now with cryptocurrency. This allegation infuriated William Buckley Jr. He said, quote-unquote, "I'm going to knock your block off if you say that one more time." And that's, of course, something that I remember more than any other moment, which shows you again that these tactics, these psychological operations work. And that's why they exist. Because they tap into something within humanity that works, even if it doesn't make any sense. Because human beings probably run more on emotion than logic. It's probably why we're fascinated with people like characters like Data and Spock and so on. While realizing you have to have a balance, like a Shatner character, to have a balance in order to have a truly interesting society that moves forward. But getting back to the point, division is nothing new. The word crypto, by the way, is used within, well, not just intelligence communities, but just in general, to indicate someone advancing a fake idea in order to turn people against the idea. In other words, one common tactic would be to pretend to be a Nazi and take an argument that might have some logical basis, but then take it to its extreme as a representative of that movement, of that ideological movement. So you can see how this would work with Muslims, right? You put somebody, you claim that this person is the face of Islam, and then you're basically boosting that person into as many eyeballs and into as many homes as you possibly can. And then people start to think, because they function more on emotion than logic, that these people, that this ideology is not for me, and furthermore, why don't we start funding our police officers and military even more than the current paradigm? And that is, of course, the reality of why all this is happening. It's not only that we are in an environment where political stunts, we have outsiders or insiders using stunts to shape the narrative in a way that allows more legislation to be passed, but not in a way that makes that legislation more accessible or more fair, especially not for the average person. And we start to realize that all this is happening because we're spending too much money on security and not enough on diplomacy. That seems odd, right? If I say that we're not spending enough money on welfare, we're spending too much money on the military. If you've grown up in America, that just seems odd to you, even though it's true. Look at how much money we spend on the military, compare that to just the federal, let's say Medicaid, and you'll see that we've got a problem, especially if you consider that we spend a lot of money on quote-unquote welfare for older people in the form of Social Security and Medicare. People that have enjoyed, for the most part, a massive housing boom that probably means that they don't necessarily, need as much of that money as compared to somebody who's got massive student loans, who's younger, and who has to buy a home that is inflated in value to the point where it may not enjoy the same sorts of gains that the older generation has enjoyed in the past. You can see again why, remember this is all about attracting capital and attracting people with capital. Because remember, if one of these homes is $1 million, somebody has to buy it. Especially in an environment, whether it's Japan or the United States, where people are having two children on average. If you look at it that way, right, you have to attract more. You have to make up the buyers through immigration in order to maintain these prices. So somebody has to buy it eventually. Only one person in the family can inherit. So, overall, when you think about the paradigm that we're in and the division that we're in, it's to maintain a situation where most cities in America spend 50% or more of their local budget, of their city budget, on public safety, firefighters and police officers. Over 50%, at least 50% in almost all cities. On the state level, in most states, especially California, the number one black hole of funding is education, especially K through 12, because we've all been convinced that education is necessary. State-sponsored education is necessary in a way that even if it bankrupts other means of elevating people into the middle class. And overall, in California, by law, we talked about the power of lawyers to shape the narrative. Once you shape the narrative that schools are failing, teachers are underpaid, even if in California they enjoy a pension fund just for the teachers, there's a different one for other government employees. Just for the teachers is over $200 billion. It's probably more now. I haven't looked at it. It's called Cal STRS, S-T-R-S. Cal obviously stands for California. You can look that up, go down into investments in the website. You can also see when I talk about attracting capital, right, it all goes together. Government's capital, attracting immigrants, people with money, and so on. Not just to maintain housing prices, but to maintain the banking system. Because all of it runs on debt. We now have more debt than ever before. Remember, the worldwide economy crashed when we had less debt in 2008 as a whole, both nationally and internationally. Now we have more debt than we had before in 2008. You put all that together, you look at the security spending, the new alliances between local police departments, that even though they receive a lion's share of local budgets because of things like long-dated obligations like pensions and other negotiations, are still in a position where they can be influenced by national grants from the Homeland Security Department, and just private grants. And I love, when we mentioned wrestling, well, you look at what happened with one of the best wrestlers in the whole world, Dave Schultz, and also one of the nicest people in the whole world. He was part of Foxcatcher Wrestling. There are movies about him, from Palo Alto, just about 20 minutes from here. And he was murdered by a billionaire, or at least, I'm not sure how much money was involved, but certainly a multimillionaire, who was one of the descendants of a Dow Jones component. I believe it's DuPont. You look at what happened there, and even after it was quite apparent that a homicide had taken place on his property, the police didn't barge in, began negotiating, and so on and so forth. And like I said, there's nothing. I don't know the strategy there. I'm not somebody who's experienced in these kinds of situations, so it may have been the right approach. But the problem is that, especially when you're dealing with an older person, so an armed older person, so I can't comment on police tactics or police strategy, but we do know that the person involved in the homicide of Dave Schultz, I don't know, I'll say allegedly, I'm not sure, I've got to be careful as well, so allegedly involved, we can see that he had donated a lot of money to the local police department. And so, this is a while ago, so maybe it's not exactly relevant, but you see how private individuals, in many cases, right, get to run the show. And one of the highlights, if you look at the documentary, one of the highlights they show is that despite being older and a little bit frail, the person involved, allegedly in the homicide, was essentially, given easy wrestling matches. He wanted to wrestle, and so he was given essentially, what do you call it? Ringers? I don't know what you call it, slang, but basically people that would take a fall. In one case, I think somebody even helped him pin himself. Helped just get himself pinned. So you put all these things together, and again, you see that a lot of this is driven by not just the idea of controlling a narrative, but the idea of becoming a market leader in a particular sport in a way that attracts people to that sport, in a way that makes people better, society better, the country better. And you can see how, if we're having these sorts of different dynamics, especially in a country with 3 different levels of regulation, state, local, and federal, you can see why division is probably a natural byproduct of this system that tries to meld public and private partnerships together while allowing local institutions to maintain independence. Thomas Jefferson has quite a few quotes on this. But you can also see how that triple layer of regulation and governance is probably bound to create massive issues if local institutions are not truly independent, but are dependent either on federal funding or private grants or banking loans. You can see how, again, some sort of executive on-the-ground action overwhelms the overall structure that was designed by lawyers and judges. So the idea here, hopefully you're able to get a picture, is that division has always been with us, that a lot of what we're seeing now is staged in order to shape the narrative. A lot of it is directed against particular people of religions, especially minorities, in order to maintain the status quo. And when you look at it that way, maybe it makes a bit more sense why even a simple hate crimes hearing or a simple social media hearing at the national level just goes off the rails so easily. And one of the reasons, of course, is that we don't even know if we're in an invasion of the body snatchers type of situation, where we know that even back in the 60s, we were able to dub flawlessly actresses' musical numbers in a way that nobody was able to figure out that they weren't the ones singing, whether it was Audrey Hepburn or somebody else in My Fair Lady. You go back and you realize in the 1990s, I believe, you've got Milli Vanilli, CNC Music Factory. You realize a lot of this could probably be done live 30 years ago. Then you go back and then you realize, I read lips. I've realized when I was looking around, in some cases, right, you had a position where there would be some sort of delay between what was being said and what was being spoken. And I thought at that time there might have been a technological issue with my television, but now I'm thinking maybe they were just working on, maybe somebody somewhere was working on a technology of dubbing that would, allow voice actors to come in and be a part of the media system in a way that would help bridge cultural gaps or any other kind of gaps. Because voice actors are obviously a big part of media. And you sometimes wonder, or at least I sometimes wonder, if when somebody claims to do an accent perfectly, you sometimes wonder if that is a voice actor who is participating in a movie and dubbing his or her voice in that movie. So there are a lot of British actors that have a flawless British accent, which I suppose makes sense, but then they go into these other movies and they have a flawless American accent the entire time, flawless. And it doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense. If you look at movies where dubbing is not used in a deceptive way, the accents actually with established actors, people that are trained in theater, the accents don't really make much sense. In one case, a British actor was trying to do a Russian accent, and he even ad-libbed in the movie that it wasn't really, you figured out that he wasn't really doing a good job. He was a professional. He's a fantastic actor. Unfortunately, I don't remember his name. He's in everything. His most famous movie is always shown at Christmas time in the UK. So, put all these things together, and overall, you start to see that a lot of the reaction in this country is occurring because people don't want to be in an environment where they're dealing with sock puppets, potentially. You put all that together, and you start to realize that a lot of the tactics that might have worked in the past, in other words, trying to create, say for example, Muhammad Ali. He's got a famous photo of himself that I've talked about before, of himself sitting on a chair reading a book, and the cover says psychological operations. In the 60s, people were kind of a little bit more open about all these things, about what was really going on. At least they understood what was going on. Probably a little bit more than we do today, because the technology just wasn't there yet in a way that would make deception and propaganda just an everyday part of life. So what you see is why is this happening? It works. Remember, it actually works. Human beings run on emotion more than they do on logic and facts, so it works. It helps maintain status quo. And it also creates a situation where you don't actually have to do any sort of substantive change. So it's also easier to say spend $1 billion elevating a lawyer into a national office, as opposed to actually fixing something like Social Security spending, entitlement spending, and imbalanced local budgets, and that triple layer of governance that I just talked about, which probably requires that the average American be 3 times as honest and hardworking as the average Chinese in order to succeed. Because the Chinese, of course, have a famously centralized system. If you think about it in that context, again, China's rise seems fairly predictable, and its eventual ascent, also above the United States, also seems fairly predictable if the status quo continues. And that the divisions, of course, hopefully you now understand them, are happening because in many cases it's a reaction to people who believe that they're not interacting with real people. They believe they're interacting with people whose voices are being dubbed in a live format. And if you look at it that way, you've got a situation where the anger that people feel at other people, not realizing that their opinions are being molded by essentially fake news or propaganda stunts. You see how that anger would cause divisions in the country. And you can also see how, this, by the way, if you think that's too conspiratorial, just remember that a Serbian war criminal, Milosevic, was able to hide out in a church for many, many years before being discovered. So this idea that you can get elevated to the top and then protected even after you commit alleged war crimes, it's just something that security forces, it's part and parcel of their playbook. And if you imagine that that's happening in a smaller country like Serbia, you can only imagine the kind of tools and tactics that are available to people in the United States and in Russia and in China and any other country that spend a lot of money on military spending. So if you look at all these situations, and you start to realize that the reason this congressional hearing is going off the rails makes a little bit of sense. In one case, a lot of law is procedure. In one case, I saw a hearing where the Congress people were just, they didn't really have anything to say, so they would give their time to a fellow party member that would then just let somebody else talk. And it was particularly problematic when, in this case, because you had a hearing on hate crimes, but that was especially focusing on, say, Middle Eastern people within the United States, and probably there will be another one that focuses on Asian people within the United States, and it'll probably go off the rails as well, because people now are thinking that they're relying more on procedure than substance, because in many cases they themselves realize that they're just part of a show that doesn't actually produce substantive change. And once you get to that level, where you're relying more on emotion than logic, on propaganda than substance, why wouldn't a country fall apart? Why wouldn't people be divided? Why wouldn't people be upset at fellow citizens for not realizing that an Argo type situation doesn't have to happen abroad, it can happen right here in the United States in order to shape public opinion? Why wouldn't the country create a system where the educational system gets a lot of the funding but doesn't actually produce an education that prepares voters for these kinds of tactics that, again, work and in the past were used successfully, were actually co-opted by minorities. Remember, Muhammad Ali, right, was a one-man psychological operation. A lot of this is because the other side used them so effectively that they forced the liberal wing to jump into the same tactics and do the same tactics. And what's really happening again is, this includes just Photoshop, and it includes enough things to the point where we can no longer figure out the veracity, really, of anything that we see, even if it's being reported on by somebody with personal knowledge. And that means that what really matters is not just substance, but integrity and credibility, which of course is something that institutions like Facebook and so on are designed to shut down. You hear about this arrest of Mel Gibson. Well, remember the pattern I talked about? Mel Gibson worked on with an Iranian, somebody of Iranian descent on one of his movies, and then again was arrested. It's so easy, and I've had this happen to me, to see a police report that's been completely doctored, it's completely false. But again, unless you're a lawyer, you don't know, you have to hire a lawyer. It's just a waste of time. And so you end up in a position where, for the most part, you are able to be almost eliminated from the national conversation on the basis of what might be a false police report. I don't know anything about Mel Gibson's case. I'm just pointing out a pattern that seems very disturbing. You see what happened to Sinead O'Connor. She had a hit single worldwide, and no one's ever heard of her since. After she, they heard about her plenty, and then she tore up a photo of the Pope on national television, and no one's heard of her since. Is it a coincidence the president of this country is Catholic now? I don't know, but I know if you control the narrative, you can control the political sphere. But you can't do it in a way that's sustainable unless you include integrity and credibility. And if you don't do it, then the situation we're in now is a natural consequence of essentially a system that runs more on propaganda than substance, more on propaganda than truth, and quite frankly, just more on political stunts than honesty. Why wouldn't things fall apart?